Irenaeus wrote that the Valentinians, again rising above all fear, proffer their own writings and glory in the fact that they have more gospels than there are. They have advanced to such a degree of audacity that they call a writing not long ago written by them the gospel of truth. You can only imagine the joy of scholars when, in 1945, an Egyptian discovered a text that begins, "The gospel of truth is a joy to those who have received grace from the Father of truth." It is true that the gospel of truth in this line is simply the first line of the text, not the title. But first lines in antiquity often served as titles. We need not exactly identify the edition of this gospel known to Irenaeus with our 4th century copies of it. At the same time, it seems that what we have is indeed a later version of what the Valentinians possessed in the 2nd century. Reading the gospel of truth has the potential to rewire the brain and to propel a spiritual breakthrough. Its musings seem to be based on a mystical experience, which led to divine insight. The text seems to have no rhyme or reason. It is a revolving whirlpool of stories and images that lead the reader deeper and deeper into insight with each successive reading. It is arguably the very first Christian homily preserved from antiquity, and its power and poetic prose continue to illumine readers today. But the question of those first scholars who studied this text has never been answered. Who actually wrote the gospel of truth? The academic consensus, it seems, is that we lack enough supporting evidence to attribute the gospel of truth to Valentinus, though several scholars remain open to the idea that it was written by him or by an immediate disciple. It is true that Irenaeus cannot be used as evidence for Valentinus's authorship because he says that a gospel of truth was written not by Valentinus, but by Valentinians. But I don't think that the later author, often called Pseudo-Tertullian, is entirely dependent on Irenaeus when he writes that Valentinus has his own gospel. Admittedly, this gospel is never identified with the gospel of truth, so it's not explicit what gospel is his own. Accordingly, the external evidence for Valentinus's authorship must be judged insufficient, but this only means that we must turn to internal evidence. The internal evidence, I will argue here, shows that the idiolect of the gospel of truth corresponds to that of Valentinus. An idiolect is an individual's distinctive way of using language. It includes their specific vocabulary, use of metaphor, key ideas, and speech patterns. It represents linguistic and conceptual characteristics that make each person's speech their own. Knowing an author's idiolect takes time and careful reading. Forgers spend a long time mastering the idiolect of those whom they wish to copy. But once one masters it, it serves as a kind of signature. One has to go deeper to look more carefully at the use of words, fundamental ideas, and sentence constructions. And that is exactly what I will do in this video, using Valentinus's authentic fragments as well as his letter on self-control. To get access to my translation and interpretation of these fragments, I encourage everyone to take my course on Valentinus. It helps me greatly. This channel depends entirely on your support. So please consider supporting me on Patreon, checking out my other courses, or by making a one-time donation. All the links are in the description. In the late 80s, Bentley Leighton considered it extremely likely that Valentinus wrote the Gospel of Truth, and he considered this for several reasons, mentioning the work's stylistic resemblance to the fragments, the uniqueness of that style, the alleged genius and eloquence of Valentinus, and the absence of a developed system in the work, perhaps suggesting that it belonged early in the history of the Valentinian Church. According to Leighton's student David Brackey, it seems almost certain that the anonymous sermon, the Gospel of Truth, can be attributed to Valentinus. Both Valentinus and the Gospel reveal an author open to visionary experience and insight, who used bold images and persuasive power. One of the few scholars who have actually argued against the idea that Valentinus wrote the Gospel of Truth is Christoph Markschies. Markschies also pointed to what he considered to be interesting similarities shared between the fragments of Valentinus and the Gospel of Truth. Both texts don't speak of a single creator, both emphasize God's unity, both present a unified and embodied Christ, and both are linked by a common use of biblical metaphors. In the end, however, Markschies preferred to emphasize mainly theological differences between Valentinus and the Gospel of Truth. The Gospel of Truth assumes a myth of Sophia, it lacks a discussion of image and archetype, and it never mentions a primal human. But even if these differences are accepted, one shouldn't jump to the conclusion that they disprove a common authorship. These differences can just as well be explained by Valentinus speaking in different contexts to different audiences. The notion that the Gospel of Truth doesn't conform to later Valentinian doctrines, such as named aeons and ordered patterns, a narrative about wisdom's fall, the birth of the Creator, and so on, that's not relevant, since the argument here is that the Gospel was written by Valentinus, who, of course, was earlier than his disciples and their published works. The attempt to say that Valentinus knew and interpreted Genesis while the author of the Gospel of Truth ignored the Hebrew Scriptures is not exactly true. The Gospel of Truth manifestly refers to the tree of Gnosis in the Garden of Eden, which is famously identified with Jesus' cross. For now, let's plunge into the discussion of the linguistic and conceptual parallels between Valentinus' fragments and the Gospel of Truth. As I mentioned in a former video, Nathan Porter has pointed out some important parallels between the Gospel of Truth and the letter on self-control. The letter says that we will be found where we send up our higher consciousness, or our nous. A very similar statement is made in the Gospel of Truth. Quote, "The place where they send their thought, that place their root, is that which lifts them up into all the heights of the Father." The they here refers to the emanations or aeons of the Father, but the aeons are models of spiritual people who identify with them. Therefore, the experience of the aeons can be mapped onto the experience of spiritual people, who are the actual readers of Valentinus' letter. In both cases, one sends up one's thought or consciousness to heaven or the higher realm. The language and thought here are strikingly close. Porter points out another parallel. On self-control says that each word has a deeper meaning. Literally, each word is a nous. The Gospel of Truth remarks that each letter in God's living book is a complete thought, as though a complete book. In context, the living book represents that invisible, immaterial act of the Father's communication made to the aeons. On self-control refers to a word or phrase, and the Gospel of Truth refers either to an individual letter in a book or less likely to an entire epistle. The metaphor is virtually identical. The experience of the aeons reading the living book is similar to the spiritual person reading the words of Valentinus' letter. They are full of miwa in Coptic, which could be a translation of nous, and nous here indicates that deeper meaning of divine communication. The author of the Gospel of Truth and of the letter on self-control were both trying to speak of the fullness of divine communication. In his fragments, Valentinus wrote that public and ecclesial books, that is, the books of the church, hold in common expressions from the heart, a code or law written in the heart. He then identifies this code or law with the people who loves the beloved, evidently Jesus. In the Gospel of Truth, the living book is manifest in the hearts of the living. Indeed, it seems that living beings, whether aeons or people, are individual letters in this book. Apparently, the book is manifest in their heart because it's a code or law written in their heart. Here again, both the language and conceptuality of the fragments and the gospel converge. In both cases, the people or entities encountering the divine writing themselves become that divine writing or code. The common use of the logos or word coming forth from the Father is too vague to draw a connection between Valentinus and the gospel of truth. More can be made of the fact that the logos of the Father is said to be the fruit of the Father's gnosis and the fruit of the Father's heart. In Valentinus's psalm, fruits are born from the depth, and from the womb is born a baby. In this poem, fruits appear in the plural, but it's parallel to the singular baby who emerges from the womb. I've argued that the womb is the womb of the Father. Feminine imagery was viewed as appropriate to God, and indeed the gospel of truth calls the Father a mother by synonymous parallelism. It also says that the Father gave birth to the Son as his child. If the word depth in Valentinus's poem is recognized as alluding to the Father, then the Father's womb gives birth to a fruit or baby who is the Logos. This language is manifestly close to the language we find in the Gospel of Truth, where the Logos is the fruit of the Father's heart. According to Valentinus Fragment 2, the Son is the manifestation of the Father's frank speech. The Gospel of Truth calls the Son the hidden aspect of the Father, who, when manifest to the aeons, puts to rest their ceaseless searching for the Father. If the Son is identified with the truth of God, he is both the revelation and manifestation of the Father to the aeons. Later, we read that the knowledge of the Father and the manifestation of his Son gave them a way to know. It's assumed here that the manifestation of the Father is the Son. He's not directly called frank speech, but it's clear that he functions as the only effective channel of communication and representation between the Father and the aeons. The idea that the Son reveals the Father is, of course, very common, but the common language of Son as revelation or manifestation of the Father is the precise parallel that I'm pointing out here. We find a similar idea expressed through the metaphor that the Son is the name of the Father. This occurs at the end of the Gospel of Truth. And it apparently means that the Son is the personal identity of the Father. The Son wouldn't be an accurate representation of the Father without the addition of this name. And we find a like reflection of this in Valentinus's Fragment 5. A face provides a model for a painting, but the painting is only validated by the addition of a name. Similarly, humans in Fragment 1 are made in the name of a pre-existent human. This statement is conceptually similar to the remark in the Gospel of Truth that they were made manifest for the glory and joy of his name. According to the Gospel of Truth, it's not just the Son who bears the name. The Father's children are worthy of his name. They are children of the name, and those among whom the name of the Father rests. By implication, if the Son has the proper name, he still shares the name with God's children, so that their lack is filled. Commenting on the Gospel of Truth, A.N.R. Thomason observes that it is also the bestowal of a name that grants authentic existence to the children of the Father. The name as granting validation or authenticity is a basic idea we find in Valentinus Fragment 5. To share the name effectively allows a person to be an accurate image or representation of the true name bearer. The assumption in the fragments and in the Gospel of Truth is common. The Son or human as name is the perfect representation of the Father, a perfect representation which makes up for a lack in the knowledge of others. In both the authentic fragments and the Gospel of Truth, it's assumed that Jesus and his fleshly body was incorrupt or unable to be decayed. It was not only when Jesus laid aside his flesh that he took on incorruptibility. He had incorruptibility while in the flesh. The Gospel of Truth says that nothing hindered his journey because incorruption is indomitable. The language here assumes that Jesus was and is incorruptible. The Gospel of Truth further remarks that Jesus is clothed with eternal life, and that he clothed himself with incorruption. Clothing is often a metaphor for taking on a body. By implication, Jesus had a body that was incorruptible. This is exactly what Valentinus states in his letter on self-control, that the embodied Jesus could not contain corruption. He could not experience decay, and therefore his gut worked to produce a divine and incorruptible body. In the same passage, Valentinus said that Jesus ate and drank, but he didn't eliminate waste. So what happened to the food inside of him? Well, I've argued that it was completely mastered and burnt up within Jesus's gut. The Gospel of Truth says that each one, the subject isn't clear here, it could be persons or aeons, each one consumes matter within himself like fire. Jesus is eternal and incorruptible like these aeons, so it's logical that he would consume the matter within himself in the same way. Jesus concocted his food by his internal fire in such a way that he mastered and burned it up within himself. In fragment 4, Valentinus uses the language of destroying or dissolving the world. The whole phrase destroying or dissolving the world is very rare in ancient literature, including Christian texts. For a true parallel, we must turn to the Gospel of Truth. According to this text, Christ came into the world, the semblance of the higher world, and by filling up the world's deficiency, he destroyed this semblance or appearance. And this appearance is immediately identified with the world in which Jesus served. In both cases, the common language of destroying the world forms a precise parallel between Valentinus's fragments and the Gospel of Truth. Of course, in the Gospel of Truth, Christ dissolves the world, while in fragment 4, it is the Christian who does so. But it's commonly recognized that in fragment 4, Christians or spiritual people specifically perform the work of Christ by an act of mutual participation. I'll also relate some further overlaps, which I don't consider decisive, but they deserve honorable mention. Valentinus emphasized the pure goodness of the Father. The Gospel of Truth affirmed that the Father is good, perfect, and even sweet. The Gospel of Truth mentions the seed of the Father and associates it with the Father's light. The seed language resembles the seed of higher reality implanted in Adam, according to Valentinus fragment 1. Valentinus referred to his audience as children, specifically children of eternal life in fragment 4, and this use of children as a name for the audience was favored by the author of the Gospel of Truth. The children in this text could stand alone or be modified by another phrase. For instance, the author refers to children of eternal knowledge and children of the Father and children of the name. Both Valentinus and the author of the Gospel of Truth exhibit a penchant for the use of the Greek term plasis or plasma, which means a modeled form or formation. According to the Gospel of Truth, error brought forth a modeled form, and material things are the formation of deception. The one who is ignorant to the end is a formation of forgetfulness. And the cooled breath of humanity exists in an animate or ensouled formation. In Valentinus fragment 1, Adam is a formation, and he was formed or molded in the name of the pre-existent human. Then in fragment 5, the name fills out what is lacking in the formation. In both cases, both authors prefer the term plasis or plasma to refer to created entities and to the human body in particular. Finally, in fragment 2, Valentinus describes the human heart as an inn for evil spirits, or alternatively, as a dwelling of daimones. The author of the Gospel of Truth advises his audience, do not become a dwelling for the devil. Common to both images is the human as a house or dwelling of daimones, the devil being the chief of daimones. The idea of demonic possession was, of course, common among Christians, but the metaphor of the human as a house of daimones is more rare. And just like Valentinus in fragment 2, the author of the Gospel of Truth insisted that one's house be holy and pure. As a special bonus, I'll mention the common use of scriptural texts. The author of the Gospel of Truth quoted dozens of texts, which later became recognized parts of a New Testament. Despite this plethora of intertextuality, it's clear that he preferred gospel texts from Matthew and John. His allusions to Matthew and John are covered comprehensively in scholarly works, but just two examples will suffice here. The author has a distinctive interpretation of the parable of the lost sheep, and this parable emphasizes mathematics. Further, Jesus' name of the Father seems to be a meditation on distinctive passages like John 17:6, where Jesus says, I have manifested your name. And seeks to grant that name to Christians. In his fragments, Valentinus clearly preferred Matthew and John as well. Fragment 5 begins with an allusion to Matthew 19:17 that only God is good, and it ends with a quotation of Matthew 5:8 that the pure in heart see God. Valentinus sees the Logos in fragment 7 and refers to the Son as a manifestation of the Father. Here we have clear echoes of John 1:1 and 18. And the Son, as the bold speech of the Father, has an obvious connection to John 16:29, where the disciples say that Jesus now speaks in bold speech, using the common word parrhesia. More examples could be given here. I think, though, the clarity of such preferences is striking given the relatively small sample size of these writings. I think we can be fairly confident that Valentinus had in his possession some version of the text that eventually became canonical Matthew and John. All these parallels, when combined, I think, establish that the author of the fragments, namely Valentinus, shared the linguistic habits, distinctive thoughts, and favored scriptures of the author of the Gospel of Truth. Thus, it seems perfectly plausible to identify these two writers. Of course, no one can know for sure, but lacking other candidates, these close linguistic and conceptual parallels still make Valentinus the best hypothesis as the author for this gospel. Of course, it could have been one of his disciples, such as Ptolemy or Heraclian, who wrote the Gospel of Truth, and I think scholarship would benefit from a close linguistic comparison between their surviving writings and the Gospel of Truth. Certainty on this question will probably never arrive, nor should we expect it. Whatever view one takes, asserting Valentinus's authorship of the Gospel is a perfectly reasonable, plausible, and scholarly position to hold. Irenaeus knew the Gospel of Truth from Valentinian Christians, evidently those in Rome. The text indicates that Valentinians were meeting together to hear homilies preached by spiritual leaders. There may have been dozens, if not hundreds, of such homilies preached by such leaders in mid-2nd century Rome. Why then was this homily preserved out of them all? Currently, it's still the best hypothesis that this sermon was preached by the most venerated of all Valentinian preachers, Valentinus himself. It was Valentinus, ultimately, who could have most plausibly claimed to have arrived at the place of repose, the very same place, perhaps, where he met the Logos face to face.